Hello, I'm Susan Dupree, and I'm here today interviewing my former mentor, Judge Norman Stahl. I've been a lawyer with Devine Willamette for over 35 years and managing partner there, and it's where I first met Norman as a very young lawyer and where he took over as my mentor. So welcome today, Norman. I'm so happy to have you here and to be able to have this interview with you.
And I'm happy to be here with you, Susan. It's been a long relationship.
It has. So I thought we'd start off by talking about your interest in becoming involved in law at all. What caused you to get decided in this, and how did you wind up at law school?
Well, that was a rather odd experience. I had no intention of going to law school, and I was interested in foreign affairs. And so when I was in my last year in college, I applied to several foreign service schools, was accepted by several, and decided to go to the London School of Economics. And had already picked my courses and was figuring out where I was going to live in London when a friend of mine came in one night to my room, and he said he had applied to Harvard Law School, and he had a spare application. And why didn't I apply? I said, because I've already accepted the London School of Economics, and I have no interest in being a lawyer. But he left the application, and I looked at it. It required your grades, a couple of letters of recommendation, most importantly, no essay, and you had to take the LSATs. They gave the LSATs at school. I went and I took them. I sent it in. I promptly forgot about it. And about a month later, 2 months later, I got a letter. I opened it and said I had been accepted to the class of 1955. And I made the mistake of telling my father, who said that I should go to law school, that what I wanted to do was really impractical. And so I thought about it and did nothing about it. The very last day, because they would not defer and London School would, I decided at, I think, 3:30 in the afternoon, I should go to law school. So I got on a bus and went from Medford to Cambridge, and I signed in at 4:45. The deadline was 5 o'clock. So that's how I ended up at law school.
I think it's fascinating that a person who ultimately became a federal district trial judge and then a First Circuit judge really wasn't going to embark in the practice of law at all at the beginning, and it was quite happenstance that you got there.
Well, that's true, and what happened was about midway through the first semester, I said to myself, what am I doing here? I don't want to be here. And so somehow my property professor, who was in his first year at teaching at Harvard, got wind of it and had me come in to see him. And he said, you're doing fine. You ought to stay at least a year. I did, and of course, eventually I graduated. Never saw him again. And many, many years later, I was on South Road on the Vineyard, and I went by a mailbox, and it said Har, H-A-A-R. At that point, I was on the United States Court of Appeals, and I mentioned it to my wife. I said, you know, I wonder if that's the same guy who taught me in law school. And this was a joke. We would go back and forth by the mailbox many, many times. And finally, she persuaded me to call him. And when he answered the phone, I recognized his voice immediately. And I said, Professor Har, my name is Stahl. I was in your first class when you were teaching in the property at Harvard in 1952. And I'm now a United States Court of Appeals judge. And if you read my work and you hate it, you have only yourself to blame. He invited me in for drinks, and we spent many years later as good friends, and it was sort of an interesting bookend to why I ended up at Harvard.
How wonderful. And he must have been very proud that one of his students achieved the height that you did in the court.
Well, all of us who mentor people always are pleased. Right now, one of my former law clerks has been nominated for the United States District Court for the District of New Hampshire, Landia McCafferty, and I'm very happy about that. She's going to be a great judge, and it's a wonderful appointment.
Well, as I recall your history, after law school, finding a job was really not so easy, even though You went to Harvard Law School, the best in the country, if not the world, which it was then and is today.
Depends on who you talk to.
Tell us a little, yeah, Bill Clinton, it might be Yale. But tell us, you know, a bit about what it was like for a young Jewish man to get a job at that time after law school.
Well, I can only tell you my own experience. I got a call from the placement director at the law school in my third year, and she said, there's no point in my sending you into any of the major Boston law firms. They don't hire Jewish people. And I went to New York and interviewed there, and I did get an offer at one of the big New York firms, but I simply didn't see myself living in New York. And I came back, and the same placement director said that there was a judge on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court who needed a clerk. I went over and I interviewed with him, and he offered me a job, and so I clerked for Judge Spalding for 1 year. It was a wonderful experience, and he tried to get me interviews in Boston, and he only got me one at a small boutique firm that did offer me a job. I wasn't interested in what they were doing, and my dad called me up and said, you know, this fellow Joe Millimet and Morris Devine have a really neat law firm in Manchester. You ought to come up and interview. I did, and some weeks later at midnight, which should have told me something about Joe Millimet, I got a phone call from him saying that would I come to work for them, and I did. Young people today would wonder. I would think I was paid $66 a week to start, and that was a very long relationship with a wonderful bunch of people.
It was. I just want to observe that I'm struck by the influence that your dad had, one in sort of orienting you towards law school in the first place, and then in coming back to New Hampshire. Did you want to come back to New Hampshire, or was it really, I've got this job possibility and I need to get a job?
I'm a New Hampshire person, and I think that coming back was easy. It was a great place in the 50s, late 50s. The bar was very small. There were, I think, 300 or 400 of us. We pretty much knew everybody. There were 5 Superior Court judges. They all knew us. We knew them. It was a very informal place. We had a saying that what goes around comes around. Right. So you had to recognize that if you didn't treat people well, they very well might not treat you well. There was a sense of comradeship within the bar. The older lawyers did tend to look out for the younger lawyers, even
yes.
from other firms. And there was a very real sense of fairness. And I think that is something that perhaps we've lost over the years because of many factors.
Well, I know when I joined Devine Millimet, which was Devine Millimet, Stahl, and Branch at the time, that it was a very exciting kind of place, and Joe Millimet created a certain level of energy and passion and excitement. When you joined the firm, first tell us what year that was.
Let's see, it was 1956.
1956, okay.
Or, yeah, I guess 56, 57.
And the firm had been around for maybe 7 or 8 years at that point?
The modern firm started after the war. Joe came back from service. Morris already was in practice, had been in practice since after World War I. It was Devine and Tobin, and Morris's oldest son, Murray, was in the firm, I think, shortly after Joe arrived. I don't know all the dates.
Right.
But by the time I got there, I think I was the 8th lawyer. Jim Malley, who eventually became a Jesuit priest and who was still a good friend, was in the firm at the time. Gus McDonough, Bart Branch, myself, Joe, and the 2 Devines, Shane, who became a district judge,
right.
and Murray, who unfortunately died at a very young age.
Mm-hmm. So what made this law firm different than any other law firm?
I think we had a sense of public service from the beginning. The Devines were very interested in democratic politics. The Democratic Party in New Hampshire in those days was a sort of a social club. They didn't elect too many people very often, and if anybody,
I think
And
it's been referred to as a cult at the time.
I think that may, Susan, that may be right. I remember that they used to loan money to get through the elections.
Now, they being your
Joe,
partners.
yeah, my partners, yes,
and
others.
And you were not a Democrat.
Well, I was probably not, but that didn't bother them too much. And I did go along. I remember when Joe and I represented Professor Herbert Hill, who was running for the United States Senate, and there was a straw candidate. And we had a hearing before the Ballot Law Commission, and we got the straw candidate to admit that after he had come out of the Hillsborough County House of Correction, where had he gotten the money for his filing fee? He said, well, it was in a jar in the kitchen. And as we were walking out, having won our case and removed him from the ballot, Professor Hill said, it's a good thing you fellows didn't ask me where I got mine, because I got it out of a jar in the kitchen.
Yeah, so it's a different time then.
Yes.
So even at this early stage, it sounds like politics was sort of mixed up, not necessarily in the cases themselves, but in the life of the law firm, if you will.
I think that's true, and I think, again, that was size related. New Hampshire was quite small in those days. The primary was new, although it had been around for quite a while, but the interest, the television was becoming important, and all of that, there was a certain ferment, and certainly the Devines and Joe were very involved in Democratic politics. And so I was there, and I breathed it in along with everybody else and caught the virus.
Now, just moving from the political side to the legal side for a bit, you initially, what did you do when you started work there?
Ours was a defense firm. We represented insurance companies in insurance defense. And there were, in those days, were what we used to call issue-to-court cases. There were small property damage cases, which today go to arbitration.
Right.
We tried those, and that's how young lawyers began to get some experience in the courtroom. We took depositions. We did a lot of things which today young lawyers don't get a chance to do.
Correct.
The firm was small, so you did everything. And we had a small business practice, and it was generally handled by Father Malley, Jim Malley, who became Father Malley. And when he left, Joe and Morris Devine said to me, well, you might as well take it over. I was the youngest one. And so I started doing the business work as well as trying to try cases. And I learned that you couldn't do both. The clients wanted you, and you were sitting in a courthouse waiting to be called, and so on. And so I began to gravitate more to the business side of what we were doing. Now,
no matter how learned by the seat of the pants the litigation, the trial side of the firm was, there was nobody on the corporate side. How did you learn how to become the great corporate lawyer that you were?
Worry. You read a lot of books. When I did the first pension and profit sharing plan,
oh my gosh,
I laid the books out on the table and figured out how to do it. And it was true with many, many things. It was often nerve-wracking as I think back on it, because there was really nobody much who could help you, and you could talk to people, but they hadn't done it either in those days. And so it was mostly trial and error, I guess. But
well, and some amount of making it up as you go.
Yes.
You know, having to make some decisions about the best way that something would work. It was quite creative.
Exactly.
A little scary, but quite creative.
Yeah, it was a good experience as I look back on it today. I'm not so sure how I felt about it then.
Now, I remember as part of the legend of the firm was an early experience that you and Joe had where you wound up going over to Europe, Belgium, I think it was. So tell us about the client and how it was that you happened to find yourself in Europe.
Well,
because for a young person at that time, going to Europe was a big deal then anyway, but...
I had actually been, right after law school, before I went to work, a roommate and I spent 9 weeks banging around Europe, and that was in 1955. And when I came to Devine Willamette, Joe had never been to Europe. And we had a client, a small client at the time, Calwell Corporation, the Keller family, and Jim Malley did the work. And when Jim decided he was going to leave, I began to do their work almost early on in my practice. And they made the Calwell panels, among other things. They make many things, but that was one of their new products.
And today they're a big operation, with very
today.
Progressive products.
Right, and all over the world. And they sold the panels for a project at the Brussels World's Fair. The American Pavilion was designed, I've forgotten by who, one of our premier architects, and the panels were going to make up the roof of the pavilion. And the decision was made to airlift them from Manchester to Brussels. And part of the deal with what was then Pan American World Airways was that a couple passengers could go on a few of the flights. I wanted to go. I was the youngest person on the totem pole. And so Joe and I and Mrs. Willamette went out one day to see the first plane. It was a cargo plane, a DC-6B with a leaking engine. And she looked at it and said, I don't want to do this. And Jim Malley was leaving the firm, so Joe said, do you want to go with me? I said, great. And I remember getting down to what was then Grenier Field, Manchester Airport, and getting on the plane. The crew had no idea who we were, why we were on the plane. And there were 2 bunks and 2 seats in the back of the plane, and the cargo was stacked up in a long row all the way down. There was a narrow corridor. And
the cargo being these panels.
The panels. So the plane took off from Grenier, and one of the crewmen who was in one of the extra seats said, I don't like the way this is stowed. But in any event, nothing happened. And I think we landed in Stevens, Nova Scotia to get fuel, because it was a long flight in those days. It was 18 hours to Brussels.
Oh my gosh.
And
3 times today.
I remember I was reading I think it was Nicholas Montserrat, The Cruel Sea. And we were over the Atlantic, and I fell asleep. And the captain had come back, and he was asleep in one of the bunks. And because they had 2 crews, it was such a long flight. And suddenly, something startling woke both Joe, me, and the captain up. The captain ripped off his seatbelt and went running down the corridor. The plane was obviously struggling, and Joe and I followed him down. I don't know what we thought we were going to do. And we were about to go into the Atlantic Ocean. Apparently the plane had iced up, and anyway, he pushed the man who was in the seat out of the seat and straightened it out. Then we got lost. And in those days, the radar was relatively rudimentary, and they shot with a sextant through a bubble in the roof, and the navigator was trying to figure out where we were. Eventually, he figured it out, and we finally made it to Brussels in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock. And as we were climbing down from the nose of the plane, it was parked way out on the field. The captain said to the co-pilot, well, cheated death again. And we...
Not what you want to hear as a passenger.
That was not what I wanted to hear.
But better to hear at the end when you're on the ground than in the air.
And the funniest part of this story is that we persuaded them that they couldn't leave us way out on the runway, and they had to drive us to the terminal, which they did in the Jeep, and they left us. They were going somewhere else. And we walked into the terminal. It was pitch dark. There was nobody there. And I said to Joe, we have to go through customs. He said, well, there's nobody here. I said, that's true, but we have to go through customs. Well, we didn't. Joe being Joe, he said, we're leaving here. We walked out, we found a cab somehow, went into the hotel, me worrying all the way in, saying, we have to go through customs. Next day, Pan American picked us up to go to the job site, and I said, we didn't go through customs. He said, oh, it's probably not a problem. And I wasn't concerned. My passport was full of stamps. Joe's was not. And we took the train out of Belgium going to France, and we somehow, nobody looked, and we escaped Belgium without any trouble. But a day or 2 after we left, the Port Authority suddenly discovered that there were 2 passengers who had come in on that plane, had gone into Belgium, and were unaccounted for. And there was a mild international incident that almost derailed the rest of the shipments, but that got straightened out. So that was how.
Now, as I'm
I ended up.
recalling, another incident in relationship to this trip was that the panels, there were issues with getting the panels onto the building, and so tell us about that.
Well, there were issues because the Calwa was only a supplier, and it was fairly clear to Joe and myself that these people were having trouble doing this, and I decided that we should call Manchester and talk to the people of the plant, which in those days was not like it is today. You had to make a reservation, you talked one way, and then you had to wait when the people talked back to you, because if you tried to talk over each other, it didn't work. And I explained to them that I thought that they better send somebody out here. These things might not get erected, which they did, and the project was a success.
So being a good corporate lawyer, staying on the scene, not just for the delivery, but to be sure
I was up on
everything went. That's what a good corporate lawyer does. They're there from beginning to end.
That client taught me more about being a corporate lawyer than perhaps anybody else, certainly more than I learned in law school by a long shot.
Now, you were at Devine for how many years, would you say?
33, 34, something like that.
So I want to move more towards the middle part of your career, that being the middle to the end of the time that you were at Devine Willamette. And one of the things that I'm curious about is who some of your clients were at the time. What kind of interesting entities were you working for? What interesting experiences did you have? You were the city solicitor for a while.
Well, that was
very interesting things happened.
That was one of those odd things. I got a call from Syl Dupuis, who was the mayor, and there had been resignations in the department. He said, "Look, we'd like you to come in for a month. Tell us what we need to do, how we should restructure the city solicitor's office." And I spoke to the firm. Maybe they said, "Well, a month we can handle." And
now, about what year are we, would you say?
Oh, God, I don't even remember. It was
how about
probably,
decade?
I would say it was probably in the 70s.
Okay.
That would be my guess. Syl could probably tell when he was mayor, but I don't remember exactly. In any event, about 2 weeks into my tenure as city solicitor, I was working at the firm in the day and City Hall at night, because most of the things that happen in the city happen at night. And Syl called me and told me that he was resigning. He was taking a position, I think, president of a optometry college in Boston, and he did. And at that point, one of the aldermen and I realized that we were going to have to run the city. I ended up as city solicitor for 6 months,
oh my goodness.
Which was sort of tough for both me and the firm, because of long hours. But it was a very interesting experience. I learned a lot about government. I learned a lot about how things really work, and dealing with the Board of Mayor and Aldermen and the myriad problems that a city has was a very, very good experience. It was the first brush I had with Grenier Field and the intermunicipal agreement with Londonderry. We worked on that.
For the airport.
The airport, and I recognized then that the airport was very important for the city, and that how it developed would make a difference.
And you were a big promoter of the airport. You served on the commission.
Well, I didn't serve on the commission as such. What I did do in the latter part of my practice, what's the group in Manchester? The industry group.
Oh, the Business and Industry Association.
It was that or one of the other ones. They had a committee. The
Chamber did too.
The Chamber, I think it was.
Yes, the Chamber was a big promoter of the airport.
Which I was the chair, and we studied the question of what to do with the Manchester Airport. And I basically authored a report which said that we should restructure the airport governance, and that this airport should become a primary engine for development in our area. And at that time, Judd Gregg was governor, and I remember going up and talking to him about the changes we needed, which did go through the legislature. And I think that what we have now, in part, developed out of that sense that we needed to really promote the Manchester airport.
I think you're right, and it's incredibly prescient that, at that period, we were looking at it, you were looking at it then and recognized how critical it would be to the state.
Yeah, at the same time I was involved in the Pease project. I represented Bechtel and another developer who was trying to take over that development of Pease. They ultimately withdrew, but that was another air industry which I thought was very important for the state and for the state's development.
Right. In addition to that sort of government flavor, which I think permeated your career over the years, other areas that I connect you with are banking. You represented the Bankers Association for a number of years. Represented Manchester Knitted Fashions, which was one of the huge
and I was a director of the Bank of New Hampshire for some time, and we represented a lot of banks. I did a lot of individual bank work for a very, very long time. I did a lot of construction, bond-related work, so I was involved in one of the first things I ever did as a lawyer was the Kank. The contractor had gone broke, and Main Bonding and Casualty Company was a main bonding company which had bonded the contractor, came over, saw Morris Devine and said, "Do you have anybody in the firm who can work on this project?" And he said, "Yes, I have a young lawyer who's got a lot of experience." I had none. And they
Don't you love those senior partners?
Right. They handed me a checkbook and they said to me, "Get the job done."
Oh my gosh.
And so
now, let's just backtrack, because you're referring to it as the Kank, but I'm not sure that all of our viewers will necessarily know what that means. So give us a little
The Kank Bankers Highway
here.
was
Lincoln to North Conway,
North
right?
Conway.
Yeah.
And the contractor, D.E. Ambrose, was a very good guy, but he had a very, very difficult project. He was doing the top portion. And
the more northern portion.
Well, it's in the middle. The highest point, the summit.
Okay.
And it was being paved for the first time, and so there was a lot of work to be done. And I secured the bond to the extent I could with liens on his equipment. He was a very good guy, and I would go up 2-3 times a week, and I worked with the engineers, and I hired people to do the work. And along with him, learned a lot about road building. New Hampshire's a great place for a young lawyer. Our highway department was terrific to work with. They were straight, and so it was a wonderful experience. And I remember the last day when we were getting ready to pave, the chief engineer said to me, "Get in the car with me." And I got in the car, and we drove over, and he said, "It's not ready yet." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, you have to understand, you can't fix a road with paving. You have to fix it by what's under it. And if you don't have a good surface properly done, the paving won't make any difference." And he said, "You need to do some more work." And he said, "Call your grader operator over." So I waved the grader operator over. He came over, and the engineers told him what to do. We rode over it again. He said, "Now you can pave." And I eventually got the bonding company all of its money back. And so they were very pleased, and I ended up doing a lot of work for them and other bonding companies over the years.
Yes, it really developed a big opening in your practice.
Yes, it did.
But I'm just so struck by the truly hands-on nature of your practice at the time, from the Cowwall client to this client, and I think you really brought that as a hallmark to Devine Willamette of what we would today call a seat at the table. It was actually more than a seat at the table. It was really hands-on.
Yeah, I had clients who used to show up at the house Sunday morning and sit around by then we had a pool, and they'd sit around the pool, and we would talk about business. We worked Saturdays in those days, and clients often came in to talk about their business issues. You were a counselor, I think,
yes.
And I think that was different. You knew a lot about the businesses. You knew the people. You knew the families. You knew the family issues, all of which made for an interesting practice. My children always said that dinner was you with a phone on your ear, and perhaps they were right. I can't deny that.
Because it was fascinating.
It was a lot of it was fun.
It really
And
was.
later, I did a lot of the work for digital equipment. And I
Yes.
did all of their big projects.
Very exciting at the time.
Yeah, it certainly was.
And also, your real estate practice was incredibly extensive, and some of the brightest lights in the real estate industry. You worked with Jerry Nash and Sam Tamposi. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I worked with Jerry and Sam. Were always interesting people to work with. They were bright. They were innovative. They were straight, and their word was good. So you could do a lot of deals without a tremendous amount of paperwork. That was a good example of somebody that was good to work, people who were good to work with, and they were. And they hired many different lawyers.
Right.
We did some things for them, other people did other things for them, but that was a good experience working with them. There were other real estate developers. We worked for the John Filopoulos family. They had been
Yes.
clients of Morris Devine. They developed shopping centers in Manchester. They developed the big hotel in downtown
Center of
Manchester.
New Hampshire.
Center of New Hampshire. And you and I,
Right.
Susan, were very instrumental. You were by then my right-hand person, and we both worked on that. I think it was the first air rights project
case.
in New Hampshire. And so there were lots of projects of that nature. We had a broad and varied practice.
You did a lot of work in the home building area. We had a couple of big clients in
We
that.
did.
And then ultimately, one of what I think of as being one of the largest projects in New Hampshire, certainly in northern New Hampshire, was Settlers Green.
Yes.
How did we come by that case?
I don't remember.
And we took an airport out.
Yes, we did.
I'm not sure how good that was.
We closed the airport in North Conway, and I used to remember coming home from hearings in North Conway, leaving at 12 o'clock at night and having to drive to Manchester, and the roads weren't quite as good then
Right.
as they are now. We did a lot of that. We did a lot of North Country work. I learned not to wear a tie, and to try to blend in so they wouldn't accuse me of being that person from downstate, basically.
I can remember that. I can remember as a young lawyer going to hearings with you and recognizing how able you were to become one of them, and you were much more educated than many of the people who sat on zoning boards and planning boards, and yet you didn't hold yourself above them in any way, and it was quite remarkable.
Well,
I remember that.
The genius of New Hampshire is our volunteer board members, and I learned when I was a city solicitor that good government just doesn't happen, and we have to respect these people who give their time, their energy to these public projects. If we had more of it in the country, we'd probably be better off.
And probably your stint as city solicitor helped you to see what it was like to actually be someone who worked in the government, and to recognize the value of the service.
And we also learned, I think, and I think it's something that the firm learned from both Joe and Morris, you never did a project unless you understood it yourself. That meant going there.
Absolutely.
That meant talking to you didn't spring it on the neighbors. You talked to the neighbors before the project was announced. You tried to anticipate what the issues were going to be, and so that you could solve those problems up front.
Right, it was a process of solving problems and trying to bring people together to the extent you could to get the best project you could. I think of you as also being involved in South Willow Street, that you did a number of things out there.
Yes, some of it, when I look at it today, I wish we had done better, but yeah, we did a lot of work on South Willow Street. I can't tell you how many traffic studies I was involved with, trying to get that to work.
Right.
And because of my experience with the Highway Department, I did have, I think, some credibility.
Yes, you did.
And I think that helped.
Made a difference.
Yeah, I think it
Absolutely
made a
made a difference. I can remember as a young lawyer trailing around after you, going from department to department as I learned about real estate law, meeting with the heads of various departments.
I think one of the things we tried to instill, it came from Morris, it came from Joe, was that your word had to be good, and if you
Right.
told people in the places of authority something, you had to be straight and you had to do what you said you were going to do.
I think the other thing was an attention to the development of relationships with people within government. And I think it was sort of second nature to you all to form those relationships.
It came from Joe and Morris.
Yeah.
You know, I remember when we did the project for digital in Merrimack, and I got the approval, I think, at 3 o'clock one morning. And when we were at the dedication, the chairman of the planning board said, "This is the first of the projects I've been involved with where the actual project is better than the rendering."
Wow.
And
what a compliment.
They did a first-rate job. And so those things were interesting. One of the fun parts of that project was I got a cut onto the Everett from their parking lot, because the interchange was a problem. We had a private toll gate, and eventually, when they redid the interchange, of course,
became
that
a piece of it.
Went away.
I don't want to leave some of your former clients without mentioning one person who was quite interesting at the time and still is, and that's Dean Kamen. You did some work for him in the early years.
I did a small amount of work for Dean. The biggest thing we did, he wanted to land his helicopter in Bedford at his house.
Right.
And he had a neighbor who didn't want him to
understandably.
And I represented Dean when we got him permission to land the helicopter at his house, and I think he still has a heliport at his current house. And that was he was a very interesting man, and as a matter of fact, I saw him not too many weeks ago at the Rudman Center dinner, and talked to him sometime. I hadn't seen him in a long time. Still doing interesting things.
He is. He's had a big effect on our state. Yeah. Just a really interesting individual. We haven't talked much about politics. We've talked a little bit about how the legislature affected your business and how you affected your clients by your relationships in the legislature. And actually, before we get on to national politics, I want to talk for just a second about some cases that you worked on where workers needed permits. And one of I think the interesting aspects of this is how often lawyers think that they can only solve problems through courtrooms and in legal ways, but many of us also realize how the legislature can be a way of helping to solve problems, or these relationships with government officials. So tell us a little bit about the Orchard case.
One of the funnier ones was I represented a New York operation which owned apple orchards in New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, and typically the apples were picked by Jamaican laborers who were brought in, who were professional pickers, came in under whatever the work programs were in those days, and they had visas, and they, for a short period of time, to pick the apples. And one year, the Department of Labor decided that we needed to have Americans pick the apples. There's no reason to have the Jamaicans here to pick the apples. And the apples were rotting on the trees, because apple picking is not easy work.
Right.
These were professional pickers. They were quite well taken care of and paid. And my client came to me and said, we're going to lose all of our apple crop. We can't get anybody to pick the apples. And so I dreamed up some kind of a complaint and went into federal court asking for the 66 permits we had applied for. And Judge Bounds, who was a practical judge, gave me an order for that the Department of Labor was to issue me 66 permits. The Department of Labor said, that's interesting, and immediately appealed to the First Circuit. And I had an order, but no practical use of it. So I picked up the phone and I called Senator Cotton, who was at that time the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee. I
Right.
told him the story. I said, you know, Senator, this is crazy. These are going to rot in the trees. He says, I think I can help you. And he said, I have the Department of Labor's budget in front of me for their legal department. He said, I won't work on it too quickly. And about 2 days later, I get a call from the Department of Labor Solicitor General who said, what do we need to get our budget for the lawyers? I said, I think 66 permits. And that afternoon, they issued me 66 permits very unhappily. We picked all the apples, and the Court of Appeals waited till all the apples were picked. I don't know whether deliberately or not. Then they reversed the order. But I don't think we had much trouble after that.
Well, that's in the department of there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Right, right.
And I think that that's really a valuable lesson.
Well, I remember Ann Teft and I had a case where we were trying to serve, I think it was a limited partnership, or I can't remember which at this point, but there was no practical way of doing it. And after the case was over, he and I sat down in our office, and I drafted a long-arm statute, and I had no client at that point, and I took it, but I just thought it was good government, that there should be a way to do this, and I took it up to the legislature, and I lobbied it through. And I think it's still good law in New Hampshire. It's been followed in other places.
That's terrific. And as a judge today, I'm sure you see the work of the long-arm statute all the time.
All the time.
It's a critical piece in our jurisprudence or our legislation. So I've stayed away from the topic of politics, but it's one that I really love, and especially your involvement in it. So tell us a little bit about what politics was like in your early years, and then we'll get into how it evolved and how your connection with it evolved.
First of all, you didn't need a lot of money. I remember we had a Democratic candidate that we were helping, who was running for governor, and I think the budget was something like $60,000.
Right.
Today, that wouldn't get you through a day, so it was different. It was more of a cottage industry in those days, and I think I first became involved nationally when Pete McCloskey was running in the Republican primary. I guess it must have been Nixon's second term.
Right.
And I was recruited by Bob Reno from Orrin, Reno, to work with him. He was
with Pete.
With Pete, and that was my first experience when we had events at the House and so on, and in national politics. It's the first time I think that the national press ever talked to me about any of this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And we got the bug, as everybody did in those days. We used to have people would stay with us at our house. We had roomers who one fellow stayed for months, and we'd have kids who would sleep in our rec room.
Volunteers who would stay.
And so forth. And so I think that election was the first time that we became really involved as a family. And as time went on, more so, I think the first statewide election that Governor Peterson's election, I worked in, I think, the peripheral way, but not in the same way as later on in the Rudman election in 1980. I was very involved for Senator Rudman. He was a boyhood friend, and Sam Temposi and me and a lot of others raised a lot of money to help him in the primary. When he won the primary, he was broke for the general election. There was no money, and we went out and we raised money for the general election and so forth. And of course, he got elected, which always is better than when your candidates lose. It's a lot more fun. And as you know, unfortunately, Susan, and then I helped John Sununu when he ran for governor. I think it was 2 years later, and worked with him on many projects for the state. And
all right, let's talk about Governor Sununu for a minute, because I think that there's some interesting connections with him. Your relationship with him and helping him ended up causing Steve Merrill to get re-involved in government. So talk a little bit about, and it caused you to be very involved on a day-to-day basis, as I remember it.
People forget that Steve was a staffer for Tom McIntyre.
Right.
And I actually was instrumental with Joe in getting him to come to Divine Millimet. And I remember after the '80 election when the governor had run against Senator Rudman in the primary, and it came in second.
Right.
I think it was a 10-person primary at the time, Republican
Wow.
primary. I had said to him, if you run for governor, I'd be happy to help you, and to the extent that I'm able to help you. And he came in to see me at the office. We were then at 1850 Elm Street, and I called Steve and came down to come down to my office, and I introduced him to John and said, you know, you ought to work for this man. He's going to be governor. And Steve was a little doubtful, but he did. And of course, he became the governor's counsel, and eventually the governor appointed him attorney general, and that's how Steve ended up himself as governor, I think.
In the early years, though, at the very beginning of when he took on that job, because I think he's worked at the firm still while he was doing it initially. Well,
more or less. He was still on our payroll. But
I can remember him being in your office, and he'd be asking you some question about, you know, you'd be batting around, you know, some of the issues of the day and how to best handle some of the dicey things that came up.
One of the real problems that John Sununu was faced with was two things. One was that when he took over, there was a large deficit for those days. I think it might have been $70 million. We thought it was about 20 during the campaign, but it was a lot more. And John had a fellow whose name now escapes me, who had been one of the industrialists on the seacoast. He was $1 a year man for him, and we had others, and we'd sit around a table and talk about how the budget was going to be balanced. The governor was very, very good. John Sununu was one of the brightest people I've ever met, and he had a real grasp of the numbers and the budget, and he was a hands-on governor, and he did a very good job of straightening out the state's finances during his three terms. Right. And
very interesting that an engineer would you know, find his way into government.
He didn't love lawyers.
No, he did not. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. We had a few moments during the years that I worked for him. It was an interesting experience. He brought me into the Public Service Company of New Hampshire bankruptcy, and I represented the state and the firm.
It was a huge case at the time.
Yes, it was. And
nationally.
Yes.
And just say why nationally it was such a great moment.
There were huge issues. It was a public utility, and it had an essential service, basically a monopoly in those days, a complete monopoly. And
was this the first potential bankruptcy
This was the
utility?
first, as I recall, this was the first really major utility bankruptcy, and the law was very, very unclear as to what rights the state had, what rights the ratepayers had, and so forth. It was sort of new territory, and I know that Larry Smuckler, who worked with me, and Mark Vaughn, my partner, who was very, very important when the company went bankrupt, he handled a lot of the in-court bankruptcy matters. We learned a lot in a very difficult area where it was very important for the state's future that we get it right. And I think that overall we did the best job we could with the hand we had. And at the time when we made the settlement in the bankruptcy court, I think I told the legislators that if the price of oil went up, the deal would be okay. And the price of oil, of course, went up, and the deal was okay. Whatever your views are of nuclear power, once I saw the nuke, I realized it was going to go online, at least Unit 1. And that was a very difficult time. It involved our working with the Congress, trying to get legislation, which we did not succeed in doing. But it was tough experience. And there's another example where John Sununu was hands-on, and Governor Gregg was hands-on when he ended up with, at the end of it, where it ultimately got settled. He was extraordinarily involved, and it was an example of state government working well.
Right, right. It's really a very interesting era for that. Now, the biggest political thing that you did that I recall was working for Senator Dole's presidential campaign. How did you evolve into that? That's right, 2 of them.
Well, as you know, Susan, there often are cattle call dinners in New Hampshire, and there was one, I guess it must have been 1979. And it was at the Highway Hotel, which is now a part of New Hampshire lore and history.
Yes,
and I went up for a dinner one night, and as I came in, Jerry Nash came out and said, "I've got Bob Dole sitting at my table, and nobody wants to sit with us because of the 76 election." And I said, "Well, I'd be happy to sit with you." And so I went in, I sat down next to Senator Dole, and we chatted, and he was, as always, funny, charming, and interesting. And following Monday, I got a call from him, and he said, "You know, I'm going to run for president, and I'd like you to help me." And I said, "Senator, you're a great guy. I don't think this is your year. I think you'd probably be better off to run for re-election from Kansas and wait." And well, he said, "I want to do it. Would you help me?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And so Bill Treat, who was then important New Hampshire person, I and a few others were the sort of the brain trust for for not a very well run Dole campaign in New Hampshire, and we didn't do very well. On the way to the polls, my son, who was then a minor, said to me, he was riding with me, "Are you going to vote for him?" I said, "If I don't, he'll know." And so we lost badly. We got 789 votes in the primary, and I can't remember the guy's name. In the Democratic side, he was a tax protester. He got 10,000 votes, and we got 789, and it was not a good experience. And those are the years when I was representing the New Hampshire Bankers Association, and Bill and I were in Washington with the association for a week. Bill Treat for a week of lobbying, and we decided we would go over and watch a Senate debate. It was early evening, and we were up in the gallery, and Bob Dole looks up and sees us, and he, talking to another senator, he points up to the gallery, and then a few minutes later at us, and a few minutes later a page came up and said, "The senator would like you to come down." And so we went down, and I said, "Bob, why were you pointing to us?" He said, "Well, I said to the other guy, those are the 2 fellows who voted for me." And then in '84, he called me and said, "You know, I'm going to run in '88. Would you help me?" And I said, "You know, if it's like it was the last time, run out of Washington. I don't want to do it." He said, "This is going to be different." And so I went to Washington, and Carol Jones and I signed on again, and it was somewhat different. We were up against a formidable foe in President Bush. Governor Sununu had a very, very good hands-on organization. It took us a long time to persuade the Dole interests. We had to do the same. We were late to that table. Dole won the Iowa caucuses and got clocked by about 3 or 4% in New Hampshire, and that was the end of basically the end of the campaign.
But I think that it's worth remarking that to be that close to these kinds of campaigns is quite an incredible experience. It's unlike any other, is it not?
Absolutely true. And you know, my children grew up thinking it was normal to have presidential candidates, governors, and senators at the House. And of course, a place like New Hampshire is so different. My wife was from Philadelphia, and Philadelphia area, and when we came back from our honeymoon, we got on a DC-3 in New York, and a gentleman sat down across from me, and it was Robert Upton, and he talked to me the entire way back to New Hampshire. he had been a United States Senator, and my wife was not happy that I was talking to this person who she had no clue of who he was. And I said, well, that was Senator Upton, and welcome to New Hampshire. It's different here. You're going to get to know people that you would not get to know in Pennsylvania. And I think that our politicians, there's a history of approachability and the public getting to know them. It's probably less so today. The state's twice the size it was then, but that certainly helped.
It is, but retail politics, I think, is still a hallmark of New Hampshire, and one of the reasons why we've been able to keep this primary. It was interesting for you to say that if he didn't, that when he lost the New Hampshire primary, essentially the campaign was over. Today, that might be a little different if you knew that you could survive other primaries, but at that point in time, which
you could not.
It was that critical.
Yeah, it was very, very critical. It had become a little less critical, but it was certainly critical then. And
so the role that you played at that time was quite enormous because this was the state where, you know, you were going to live or die.
It was make or break, and we were doing actually very well. And I remember on a Saturday before the New Hampshire primary, we were at an event in Peterborough, which had gone very, very well. And Richard Worthland was the pollster for the Dole campaign. He and I were talking. I said, I'm going back to Washington. We've got this in the bag. And I said, Richard, I don't think so. There's an undecided vote out there, and that undecided vote is going to make this primary. And he said, oh, you're wrong. And so in any event, over the weekend, the Bush campaign they brought in Barry Goldwater. They had some excellent ads, and we had nothing. And I ran into Worthland at the inauguration. I said, Richard, you promised me a different inauguration. And he said, well, I went and repolled. He said, we lost all the undecided. I said, well, and it's never over until it's over.
It never is. That last weekend, you know, those of us who love to prepare, we think we've prepared, we think we've got it all done early, and then, okay, the weekend is coming, we can let up. And that's when these races tend to be won or lost.
That is absolutely true,
those
Susan.
very last 3 days.
You know, it's
amazing.
interesting. I was looking at the polling in the Massachusetts senatorial race yesterday. It's gone from a 17% lead to a 7% lead. And there are so many things that can happen even when you don't expect them. That's why people run as hard as they do these days.
That's right. And it's a trend line. It's watching, it's not just the numbers, it's the trend. Well, I think that your involvement with Senator Dole, who went on to lead the Senate for many years, also really, and Senator Rudman and John Sununu, who went on to become Chief of Staff to President Bush, really influenced your later years. Aside from making it fun and exciting for you in the practice of law, it also led you away from the law firm. And you were offered a position in the federal judiciary. Tell us about how that evolved.
Well, I was at a stage in my career, I had done it for a long time, and I wanted to do something different. I think that if Senator Dole had become president, I would have done something different. And shortly after the election, I was interviewed for a few things in Washington. Nothing was quite a fit that either I wanted or the particular one was I the right fit for. And then I got a call from I can't remember if it was I think it was Senator Rudman, saying there was a vacancy in the judiciary in New Hampshire, and they would like me to become a nominee if I was interested. And initially I turned Senator Rudman down, and then I had breakfast with him in Nashua and a long discussion, and I talked to Judge Bounds, I talked to Judge Devine and Judge Laughlin, and I talked to then Justice Souter on the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and eventually I did become the nominee and became a United States District Judge, where I was for about 18 months. And then after Justice Souter had gone to the Supreme Court, there was a vacancy there, and ultimately I became the nominee. And went on to get confirmed, and I've been on the Court of Appeals for 21 years, so I've been a federal judge for 23 and a lawyer for a long time.
So tell me what the process was like the first time. My recollection is it was a different process when you went from the Federal District Court to the First Circuit, but back in that time, it was a rock and rollin' kind of process to get to become a federal judge.
Well, it still is.
That's true. It still is.
It's a difficult process. Initially, Senator Humphrey wasn't thrilled with my nomination because of, as he said to me one day, "You're a friend, but you have too many friends, and this is not probably where you're going to stop." And he felt that on some of the hot social issues that because of my wife's position that I might have the same ones that she had, and
that didn't align with his.
That did not align with his, and so I had said to Senator Rudman, I said, you know, if Senator Humphrey doesn't sign the slip, this is going nowhere. The firm is not thrilled with my doing this, and I don't want a protracted fight about it. And so one day, it's New Hampshire politics, wonderful thing. I'm sitting at my desk, and our then telephone operator said, "You have guests." I said, "Who are the guests?" She said, "Well, you have Senator Rudman, Senator Humphrey, and John Sununu, Governor Sununu, who was then the chief of staff to the president." So
unexpected.
Unexpected. So they all showed up in my office, and we sat around a table, we talked about it, and Humphrey said, "Okay, I'll sign the slip."
Meaning it would get out of committee?
It would get out of committee. I would have a hearing.
Yes, which is where these things get bottled up.
Right.
In committee, not being able to get out for
and,
hearing.
and that's ultimately what happened. And
so how was your hearing? And did you get prepared for it? Did you have to do work to do that?
The first hearing, Senator Cole chaired my first hearing, and he was very gentlemanly. I had gone to law school with his brother, and I don't recall very much about the hearing other than the fact that Bob Dole introduced me, which was a very nice gesture on his part.
And a significant gesture.
Yes, it was at the time. And as we were walking out of the hearing, he turned to me and said, "Well, Norm, if I had won, you wouldn't have been doing this." And so, the second time around was more, there was another candidate, and there was a long period where back and forth, and that hearing, again, I already had a record, and Senator Metzenbaum chaired that hearing, and he wasn't happy with a couple of my decisions, and so I got a fair amount of questioning on that, and I had to answer quite a few written questions, but I got out of committee unanimously, ought to pass. There was a hold on all nominees, though, at the time, and they told us they did not know. It was the last year of the Bush 1 administration before the election, and so, as is always the case, nominations
held up.
Are held up, and many of the nominees never got hearings or never got confirmed. And on a Friday afternoon, I got a call from the Justice Department saying, "We don't understand how it's happening because there's a hold on all nominees, but you were approved this afternoon." Gordon MacDonald, who ultimately had originally worked for Senator Humphrey as his chief of staff, was a clerk of mine at the time, and Gordon went online and came back to me, called in and came back to me and said, "You were a number on the consent calendar, not a name, a number." And Senator Dole, Senator Kennedy, and I think Senator Biden were in the chamber, and that was it. And that's how you got approved. And,
quite a story.
So anyway, but most people who are federal judges have similar stories.
Now, I'm going to, in a minute, wrap up with your most noteworthy cases. But before we get to that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the interesting experiences that you've had being on the First Circuit Court. One of them being your job in the building of courthouses, which is really quite remarkable.
Well, I always had an interest, as you know, Susan, in construction and building, and that became known in at the Washington level, and I was serving then on Committee on Technology, and I got a call from the head of the administrative office of the court and said that the Chief Justice wanted me to switch committees to go on to the Security and Facilities Committee, which was the committee in charge of both judicial security in those days and the construction of the new courthouses. This was just at the beginning when all the new construction was coming online. And so I said, fine, and then I was invited to Washington for a hearing, and I knew zero. This was the second day I'm on the committee, and I'm sitting at the table in the Senate chamber on a hearing on the courthouse project with the then chairman of the committee, and the chairman of the Senate committee turns to me and starts to ask me questions. I said, this is my first day on the committee, and I said, I'm sorry, I really don't have the knowledge to answer your questions. And I went back to Concord. 2 days later, I discovered I was the new chairman of the committee. And so I spent 3 years, as much as 30 days a year in Washington, lobbying, basically, appearing before the Senate, the House, with staffers working on the projects across the country. I traveled around the country and testified on many projects that were necessary. I think the thing that I'm proudest of, however, is the Rudman Courthouse.
Right, which is right here in Concord.
Which is right here in Concord. And when I got there, we were in the old Cleveland building, and the courthouse was a mess.
It was.
And I got some work done, and was able to commission a study as to whether it could be rehabbed. And I was told by the GSA that rehabilitation for a modern courthouse was not possible there. And so we started to work towards getting the funding for a new courthouse. And I was on the group, the small group that picked the architect. We picked Jean-Paul Carlian, who was a Beaux-Arts designer, trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, and we had a wonderful relationship, he and I, and he understood what I was trying to do, and we were able to put together what I think is a very, very effective courthouse. At the time, I had to go to Washington to get approval for the kind of things we did here. I wanted exterior light. All the courtrooms were interior in most of the new courthouses. I didn't want that, and I was able to persuade them to allow us to do that. I wanted to have a collegial floor. Courtrooms not assigned to the judge, but assigned to the case, and that's how this courthouse was designed. And it was a wonderful experience. When I went on the Court of Appeals, Joe DeClerico came on board and was instrumental in the final cleanup of getting it done. I think we have a great courthouse, and I look back on that as one of the things I think I leave to the lawyers of the state of New Hampshire. Well, we would not get that today.
No, we would not, and it's quite an incredible piece of architecture.
And I also have to say that our delegation was very helpful in our being able to do it. They turned to the Democrats, the Republicans, everybody helped, and we built that courthouse for $29 or $30 million. You couldn't build it today for $100 million, and the money would not be available. And Jim Starr, who was the clerk of court about to retire, was absolutely marvelous in getting that into the shape it is. It was
definitely an effort by a lot of different people coming together to make it happen, and it shows in the product. You talk about going to Washington a lot, and I can't leave our discussion without touching on going to the White House, because I just think it's so exciting. Did you get to go to the White House, and under what circumstances? I mean, you were friends with John Sununu, he was chief of staff, so...
I did on several occasions, both because of my position as chair of the committee, and because John invited me on a few occasions. I was went to see him several times, and one of the times he said to me, "Would you like to see the Oval Office?" And his office was just down the hall, and I walked down with him, and the president was not there, and the rope was up, and he said to the secretary, let Norm go in by himself and see whatever he wants to see. And I wandered around the president's office, and there's a little side office, and I remember there was a pillow on the couch that said, "Happiness is being president." And and then I was there at one point, I think once or twice, with the budget for the courthouse projects. I went to see whoever was then chief of staff, and with a former chief of staff and so forth. And that was an interesting experience, because as we were talking with the then chief of staff, someone came in and he signed a paper, and I found out later on that was an authorization to bomb somewhere. But, so, you know, the West Wing is small, as you know, and it's a very, but it's a very interesting experience.
And it is a beehive of
activity.
Major activity.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And I think when you're in the White House, you just have that sense of momentousness,
right.
And that's why I'm asking you these questions, because you have, you know, been able to be a first-hand observer, and it's just fascinating.
As you walk out, as you know, as you walk out of the West Wing, there's often reporters there, and they're trying to figure out who you are and why you're there. But anyway, that was a good experience.
So my last question is about cases that you've worked on at the First Circuit that you find particularly noteworthy. And I know one of your most recent things that you've worked on,
there are two that
noteworthy.
There are two that I look back on as I think are both major cases. One was Lotus versus Borland, which occurred fairly early in my career. And yesterday I was having lunch with Judge Boudin, who was on the second panel with me on the case. I was the writing judge. He wrote a concurrence, and he said, you know, we really did an important job in that case. And I said, I think we did. That case involved whether copywriting of software.
Yes.
And we said in the particular case it was not copyrightable. And that probably had a lot to do with the innovation which occurred subsequently in software. And that's probably why there's a push to try to patent software. And it's a big issue. Case went to the Supreme Court. It split 4-4. I am reasonably certain that if Justice Stevens had sat on the case and I think it was Stevens, had not been recused, it probably would have come out 5-4 my way because of his view of antitrust and so forth, but you never know. The most recent case is one called United States versus Worry, and that involved a cell phone and whether the police can look at the cell phone data, manipulate it in connection with an arrest without a warrant. And ours was the First Circuit to rule that they could not.
So they needed a warrant to look at your cell phone.
Except under the exigent circumstances.
Right.
But that case will probably end up in the Supreme Court. It was argued out of Washington. It's an important case.